Hey there. Ready to become aerodynamics experts? Like, seriously, whether you're prepping for a big presentation, need a refresher, or just can't stop thinking about how planes stay up. We're diving into all things flight today.
It's going to be a fun one, promise.
I'm all about the fun. We're breaking down the core principles, all from this source material we've got, aero112.pdf. Think of it as your cheat sheet to sounding like you aced aerospace engineering.
Exactly. It's amazing how many people see planes defy gravity every day and think, how is that even possible?
Yeah.
We're going to break it down so it all makes sense.
Love it. And aero112.pdf starts with the basics. Air and atmosphere sound simple, but it's the foundation of everything.
It is.
Like, did you know humidity can really mess with a plane's performance?
Oh, for sure. Ever notice your car feels sluggish on those super humid days?
Yeah.
Same thing for planes. That thick air full of moisture makes takeoff harder.
If it's heavier.
Kind of the opposite.
Hmm.
Humid air is less dense than dry air because, well, water vapor is actually lighter than air molecules. Fewer air molecules to push against means.
Less lift. It's like trying to swim through soup instead of water.
You got it. And less lift means pilots need longer runways on those humid days just to get enough speed for takeoff.
Wild. So air density is key, but our aero112.pdf also mentions things like static pressure, temperature, viscosity. Do those play a big role too?
They do. All of them. Take air pressure, for example. Think about that feeling you get in your ears when a plane's climbing.
Oh, yeah, that poppin' feeling.
Exactly. That's air pressure changing as the altitude changes. You know, our source material uses the example of 18,000 feet. The air pressure up there is only about half of what we experience here on the ground.
Wow. Okay, so higher you go, thinner the air. Makes sense why they pressurize those cabins. But what about temperature? Does that have a big impact on flight too?
Definitely. And to understand that, we got to think about the different layers of the atmosphere.
Ooh, okay, layers. I like it. It's like a cake, right? Each layer's a bit different.
Perfect analogy. Each layer's got its own temperature profile, and that definitely impacts how a plane flies.
All right, layer cake time. Aero112.pdf mentions the troposphere first. That's where most planes spend their time, right?
Right. The troposphere is the densest layer, great for generating that lift we need. And as you go higher in the troposphere, generally the temperature drops. The Earth's surface is the main source of heat, so further away, colder it gets.
Makes sense. But then it gets kind of weird, right? Because the next layer, the stratosphere, that's where the ozone layer hangs out.
You know your stuff, and that ozone layer really messes with the temperature.
Because it protects us from those harmful UV rays, right? What does that have to do with temperature, though?
It's all about that UV absorption. The ozone layer soaks up a ton of energy from the sun, and that, well, causes temperature inversion.
Inversion, you mean?
Yep. As you go higher in the stratosphere, the temperature actually starts to increase.
Wait, warmer as you go up? That's wild. And there's that other layer, right? The super cold one.
You're thinking of the mesosphere, the layer above the stratosphere. Our source material, aero112.pdf, says it's home to the absolute coldest spot in the Earth's atmosphere. We're talking a bone-chilling 90 degrees C.
Brr. Good thing planes don't hang out there too long. So, we've got air density, atmospheric layers. It's clear that to really get flight, you gotta get air.
What's next on our aerodynamic adventure?
Now that we know what we're flying through, it's time to dive into the forces that actually make it all possible. Lift and drag. Get ready to unlock the secrets of how a big hunk of metal manages to soar through the sky.
All right, lift and drag. Those are the forces that make or break flight.
They're the stars of the show, and aero112.pdf really breaks them both down.
But before we get too far, something piqued my curiosity in the source material. They mention fluid flow. What's that all about?
It's a good one. Think of it this way. Even though we can't see it, air acts like a fluid, especially when it's moving over those wings.
Okay.
Aero112.pdf uses the example of air moving through a pipe. Imagine that.
Got it, like air in a pipe. The amount of air going in one end has to equal the amount coming at the other, right? Unless there's a leak somewhere, which we don't want. That's basically mass flow.
So it's like if you have a river, the same amount of water is flowing through those wider parts and the narrower part.
Exactly. And just like a river speeds up when it's squeezed through a narrow gorge, the air speeds up when it has less space. That's that continuity equation in action.
Which brings us to Bernoulli. Our source material says this principle is directly tied to how lift happens. Faster air, lower pressure. Am I on the right track?
You're spot on. Aero112.pdf even has that diagram, figure 3.3. It shows how this works with an airfoil. The wing's curved on top, right?
Right, curve on top, flatter on the bottom.
So because of that curve, the air traveling over the top has to cover more distance than the air going underneath.
To meet up at the back end of the wing?
Exactly. It's like a little race.
Huh.
And to catch up, that air on top has to speed up. And that's where Bernoulli's principle comes in. As the air speeds up, its pressure drops. Meanwhile, that air underneath, it's moving slower, higher pressure. That difference creates an upward force lift.
So you're saying just changing the wing's shape, making that curve, creates this pressure difference, and that's what generates lift. That's amazing.
It's pretty cool, right?
Mm.
And the source material even gives us a sample calculation. You can see just how fast that air has to move over the wing.
So cool. We've tackled lift, but what about measuring speed? Seems important when you're flying.
You'd think it'd be simple, but it gets kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Pilots actually use several types of airspeed, depending on what they need to know.
Several types.
There's the speed they see right there on their instrument panel. They indicated airspeed, right? Then there's the calibrated airspeed, which is adjusted for any instrument errors. And then we get to equivalent airspeed.
Oh, boy.
This one considers how compressible the air is at different altitudes, and speed's super important as you get closer to the speed of sound.
And how about true airspeed?
That's the one that takes everything into account, including wind conditions.
Oh, many airspeeds. It's a lot to keep track of. Aero112.pdf mentions a pitot-static system. Is that what helps pilots with all of this?
That's it. Clever system. It uses the difference between static pressure, that's the air pressure around the plane, and dynamic pressure, the pressure caused by the plane actually moving through the air.
Clever indeed. So we've got speed, at least somewhat figured out. Back to those forces, we covered lift, but drag always sounds like the bad guy in the flight world.
Well, drag's just the force that resists that forward movement through the air. Think of it like this. Ever run your hand through water?
Sure, all the time.
You feel that resistance, right? That's drag. Our source material, aero112.pdf, breaks it down into different types, and each one has its own source.
So it's not just one kind of drag.
Not at all. You've got induced drag, that's kind of a byproduct of lift. Those little swirls of air, vortices, they form at the wingtips, those create drag. Then there's parasite drag, caused by the friction of the air flowing over the plane's surface.
So smoother the surface, the less parasite drag. Those little rivets and antennas, I bet they all add up.
You're getting it. Aero112.pdf breaks down parasite drag even further, actually. Skin friction drag, form drag, interference drag, and even leakage drag.
It's a lot.
It can be.
So efficient flight is all about maximizing lift, minimizing drag, like finding that sweet spot, right?
You nailed it. That's
Yeah.
where the really cool engineering comes in.
Yeah.
Aircraft designers, they've come up with some amazing ways to manipulate both of these forces.
Speaking of which, our source material talks about flaps. Those are the things that extend from the wings during takeoff and landing, right?
They're like a secret weapon for more lift.
What do they actually do?
Well, Aero112.pdf has this visual, figure 6.1. It shows a few different types. Essentially, flaps change the shape of the wing, making it even more curved.
So a temporary lift boost, why not just have those flaps down all the time?
You're thinking like an engineer. It's a trade-off. While flaps are great for that extra lift at lower speeds, like during takeoff and landing when you need that extra help, they also create a lot more drag.
Ah, so it's a balancing act, more lift, but at what cost? Which brings up something else. Aero112.pdf mentions stalls. I'll admit, stalls kind of freak me out. What causes them? Okay, stalls. We were just talking about those flaps giving you extra lift during takeoff and landing. But like, if you increase lift too much, isn't that when you risk a stall?
You're totally on the right track. It's not just about how much lift you have. It's about the angle the air hits the wing. We're talking about angle of attack.
Angle of attack.
Aero112.pdf actually debunks that myth that stalls are all about going too slow. You can stall at any speed if that angle gets too steep.
Wait, really? So even if a plane's going super fast, it could still stall? That's a little unsettling.
It all comes back to the airflow over the wing. If that angle of attack gets too steep, the air can't follow that curve of the wing anymore.
Oh, I see.
It separates. And that's when you lose lift and, well, the plane drops. The source material has a great diagram, actually. Figure 5.2 shows this really clearly.
Okay, yeah, that visual makes it much clearer. But how do pilots even know if they're getting close to a stall? Are there, like, warning signs?
Totally. One of the biggest ones is buffing of the plane will actually shake because that airflow is getting all turbulent as you get close to the wings. And thankfully, planes these days have stall warning systems.
Oh, good.
Right. They've got alarms in the cockpit that'll go off if that angle of attack gets too high.
Phew, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So if you hear that alarm, you know to adjust. And quickly, what do pilots do to recover from a stall, though?
The key is decreasing that angle of attack. Basically, point the nose down a little, let the air flow smoothly over the wings again.
Get that smooth airflow back. So we've talked about how planes take off, land, how to avoid those scary stalls, but what about everything in between? Like the actual performance of the aircraft when it's up there.
Aero112.pdf gets into that too, with something called performance curves. Think of these curves like cheat sheets for pilots and engineers.
Cheat sheets, love it.
They show how a plane's going to behave at different speeds and altitudes.
Okay, so like a visual guide to what the plane can do.
Exactly. There's a curve for pretty much everything. For example, there's one that shows how much thrust the engines need to produce to keep the plane cruising at a steady altitude at different speeds. That's the thrust required curve.
So pilots can use that to figure out the most fuel-efficient way to fly, right? Like how to squeeze out every last mile per gallon.
You got it. And our source material covers other performance factors too, climbing, gliding. There's even a sample calculation showing how an aircraft's glide ratio, that's how far it can travel horizontally for every, say, 1,000 feet of altitude it loses, depends on its lift-to-drag ratio.
So like a really sleek aerodynamic plane's going to glide farther than a clunkier one.
Exactly. And all of this performance data is super important during takeoffs and landings, which Aero112.pdf reminds us are the most demanding parts of any flight.
Makes sense. Those always feel the most intense, even just as a passenger. What makes them so tricky?
A lot of factors come into play.
Ah.
Altitude's a big one. Remember how air density decreases the higher you go? That means planes need a longer takeoff run at higher altitudes. Thinner air makes it harder to get that lift.
Makes sense. And a heavier plane needs more runway too, right?
Of course. Plus, you've got wind to factor in. A headwind, that's wind blowing towards the plane, can actually help shorten the takeoff distance.
Really?
Yep, but a tailwind, wind pushing from behind, opposite effect, makes that takeoff distance longer. Aero112.pdf even walks through the calculations to show just how much of a difference those winds can make.
It's amazing what pilots have to think about, even for a routine flight. What about landing then? Seems like there's even less room for error when you're close to the ground.
You're not wrong. Our source material points out that because of that, landing speeds are usually higher than stall speeds. It's about having that safety margin, just in case a sudden gust of wind hits or there's an issue with the controls.
That buffer is probably a good thing. Now, one more thing from Aero112.pdf. I wanted to touch on the VN diagram. It sounds a little intimidating, not gonna lie.
I promise it's not as bad as it sounds. Think of the VN diagram as a guide for how much a plane can handle. It basically plots the plane's speed against something called its load factor, which is just a fancy way of saying the ratio of lift to the aircraft's weight.
Okay, so it shows how different maneuvers, like those sharp turns, put stress on the plane.
You got it. Figure 9.2 in Aero112.pdf shows this perfectly. It even highlights key points, like the maneuvering speed is the fastest you can go when making those turns without risking structural damage to the plane.
Like knowing how hard you can push a car before the tires lose their grip. So pilots use this diagram to stay within safe limits.
Exactly. Got to stay within those limits, keep the plane happy and in one piece. And speaking of control, our source material also talks about stability.
Right, because a plane that's constantly bouncing around up there wouldn't be a very fun ride.
Definitely not. Our handy source breaks down stability into 3 types. Longitudinal stability that keeps the nose pointed in the right direction. Lateral stability that keeps the wings level. And directional stability that one keeps the plane from fishtailing.
So like 3 invisible forces all working together to keep things smooth.
Perfect way to put it. And Aero112.pdf explains how those stabilizing forces are literally designed into the aircraft, like the dihedral angle of the wings, for example.
Dihedral angle, refresh my memory.
You know how airplane wings are slightly tilted upwards, like a bird's wings?
Yeah?
That's the dihedral angle. Subtle, but it's a key design feature that makes the plane more stable. It helps it self-correct if it starts to tip to one side.
It's all about those little details. We've covered a ton today, from what air is made of to those invisible forces that keep us flying. We even touched on stalls, performance curves, that VN diagram.
And we've just scratched the surface. Aero112.pdf gives us an awesome foundation, but there's so much more to discover about flight, and aviation's changing all the time.
Right. Think about what's next. Supersonic airliners making a comeback, maybe even hypersonic travel someday. It's exciting to think about.
And it all comes back to these basic principles of aerodynamics.
Absolutely. Understanding how it all works is how we unlock the future of flight. We'll have to leave it there for today, but for our listeners, keep that sense of wonder alive. Next time you see a plane in the sky, take a moment to appreciate the incredible science and engineering that makes it all possible.
Who knows, maybe someone listening will be the one to design the next big aviation breakthrough.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into aerodynamics. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring the wonders of the world around you.